At 0617, the fog sat thick over the tree line, low and unmoving, muffling the usual morning sounds of the Vermont countryside. The gravel of the parking lot cracked softly under the weight of worn tires as an old silver sedan pulled into the lot of Riverbend Shooting Range. Frank Sullivan, sipping black coffee from a battered thermos, watched from behind the front office window, his breath fogging the glass. She stepped out slowly, wearing faded jeans and a plain navy jacket zipped halfway up. Her baseball cap, a dull shade of gray, was pulled low, concealing most of her face. In one hand, she carried a long, black hard case. No decals, no unit patches, no stickers, just clean and anonymous. Frank had seen plenty of shooters walk through those gates, but something about her stillness, her total absence of nervous energy, made him pause. She didn't sign in, just nodded at the clipboard outside the office and moved straight to lane 11, the one farthest from the others. Most folks chose the center lanes for convenience, but she took the one backed by trees, near the old supply shed. She set the case on the bench and opened it with deliberate care. The rifle inside was clean, black, and lean. Nothing flashy, no visible branding. He couldn't see the optics, but as she began assembling it, he realized there weren't any. Frank stepped out into the morning chill. He didn't say anything, just leaned on the railing and watched. She moved with the ease of someone who knew what every part did before she touched it. Her hand tightened the bolt with just the right resistance. Her cheek rested naturally on the comb. She loaded one round from a 5-round mag and settled in without fanfare. At 0642, the first shot broke the morning silence. No flinch, just the clean crack of suppressed fire. Through his range binoculars, Frank spotted the mark. Center mass, target at 150 yards. Nothing remarkable. The next shot came 10 seconds later. Headshot. The next, upper right lung. Then 2 more shots, both perfectly spaced heart and sternum. Same pattern repeated on the target 250 yards out. No scope, no spotting gear, no measuring instruments for wind. Frank narrowed his eyes. There was a soft breeze rolling down from the ridge behind the range. Crosswind, light but tricky. Most civilian shooters used wind flags. She didn't even glance at one. Instead, she paused between shots, shifted her shoulders just slightly, and fired again. The bullet struck a swinging steel plate at 320 yards. He'd seen people try for that plate and miss repeatedly with full setups. She hit it dead center. A regular Mike Garrison wandered up to Frank, jaw working nervously on gum. She always liked that he asked. Frank didn't answer right away. He just kept watching the woman reload with fluid, practiced rhythm. Mike leaned in. Something about her's not sitting right with me. She doesn't have a badge. Ain't filled out no waiver. Who the hell shoots like that without glass? Frank nodded, partly to himself. He was already thinking the same thing. At 0710, he walked back inside and checked the sign-in sheet. Blank. No name. No range card, no driver's license logged. He picked up the phone and stared at the number for the sheriff's office. He hadn't called them in years. Mostly handled things himself. But this wasn't nothing. He looked out again. She was adjusting her sling, shifting to prone without any wasted motion. Another magazine appeared from her jacket, loaded cleanly. Another series of shots, tighter groupings, longer range. Her breathing was the giveaway. 4 count in, 2 count pause. Gentle, steady exhale as she squeezed the trigger. Frank knew that rhythm. It came from training, not instinct. Real training. Military. At 0726 she stood, broke down the rifle, and repacked it. No sign of strain. No pride either. Just routine. She started walking back to the lot. Frank opened the office door, but she didn't look his way. She moved like someone with a destination in mind. Not in a hurry. Just ready for whatever came next. He made the call. Not to 911, not yet. Just the direct line to Deputy Wallace. Might be nothing, Frank said. But I got someone here I think you should meet. Might be worth a quiet conversation. As he hung up, he noticed she hadn't driven away yet. She was just sitting in the car, eyes on the tree line, engine off. Frank stepped back inside and poured a second cup of coffee. He didn't believe in ghosts. But sometimes, when someone moves like they've lived in places no one wants to talk about, you pay attention. And this woman, whoever she was, hadn't missed once. At 0742, Deputy Wallace pulled into the gravel lot with his partner. A younger officer named Rodriguez, who still wore his academy haircut like it, was a badge. Frank met them at the office, arms folded, eyes scanning the range where the woman had returned to her bench. She was seated now, cleaning the bolt assembly with care. Wallace asked what exactly the concern was. Frank didn't speak for a moment. He just handed over the waiver clipboard, still blank. Rodriguez watched through the glass. No license plate on the sedan. No range pass, no scope. She's just shooting, Wallace asked again. Frank nodded, but too well. Too calm. Rodriguez gave a soft snort. That's not illegal. Frank didn't answer. Instead, he pointed to the paper target at 400 yards, the one hanging off by the tree line. One hole, dead center. The woman had hit it 6 times in a row, with iron sights. At 07:58, they approached her slowly. Wallace kept his hand near his holster but didn't draw. Ma'am, we need to see some identification and your permit for that rifle. She stood without hesitation, hands relaxed at her sides. No twitch, no shift in posture. I don't have those with me. Her voice was low and even. Rodriguez asked her name. She said nothing, just stood there, eyes steady, watching the tree line beyond them as much as the officers themselves. They took the rifle. She didn't resist. Wallace removed the magazine, cleared the chamber. 5 rounds, clean brass, standard .308. The rifle was unmarked, no serials, no brand. Rodriguez checked her coat pockets and found a plastic key card with no logo, no barcode, just a magnetic strip. The notebook had 10 pages, all filled with what looked like grid coordinates and wind speeds. At 8:13, she was in the backseat of the cruiser, wrists in cuffs, staring out at the tree line like it was more important than anything they'd said. At the sheriff's office, the booking was quiet. She gave no name, no address, didn't ask for a lawyer. Her fingerprints came back with no matches. Local, state, even military databases showed nothing. Rodriguez ran her photo through facial recognition. No hits. By 08:47, she was in cell 2, concrete bench, security camera overhead, steel toilet in the corner. She sat straight-backed, legs crossed at the ankle, hands folded in her lap. She hadn't asked a single question. Wallace watched the screen, shaking his head. No reaction. Not even when we mentioned terrorism charges. Frank had dropped off the rifle at the front desk. The evidence tag read unknown precision rifle, possible illegal modification. Detective Marcus Wells arrived at 09:35, late 40s, former Army CID, now running investigations in 3 counties. He took one look through the glass at the woman and muttered that she didn't fit anything he'd seen before. Most people screamed, cried, begged. She just watched, calm, unreadable. He tried talking to her, told her he was there to help. She gave no answer, just tilted her head slightly like she was analyzing something behind him. At 10:10, she finally moved, not to speak, but to stand and walk to the far corner of the cell. She looked up at the camera, then shifted 3 feet to the left. A blind spot. Wells noted it. When she sat down again, it was in the exact middle of the bench. Not slouched, not stiff, just centered. Wells opened the evidence bag again and pulled out the notebook. The coordinates were consistent with multiple sites across New England, most of them along coastal routes. Some matched shipping lanes. Others were marked with wind notations and times of day. None were labeled. No context, just data. By 11:22, Wells tried again, offered her water. She took it with a slight nod. The sleeve of her jacket slid back for a second, revealing a scar on her wrist, long and flat, about 2 inches, not random, not accidental. He'd seen that kind before. From fast rope descents during ha-ho jumps, she saw him notice. Her voice came then, soft and flat. Rock climbing accident. It was the first lie he could identify. Rock climbers didn't get scars like that. Not there. Not like that. At 12:05, the sheriff asked if they should escalate. Federal call. Maybe ATF. Wells said not yet. Something about this felt too quiet for that. Too precise. If she was a threat, she was the calmest one he'd ever met. And if she wasn't, they were about to embarrass themselves on a national level. By 13:40, Rodriguez walked past her cell and swore she was counting something. Her eyes followed the hallway pattern, stopping every 6 seconds. Camera rotation, maybe motion sensors. Wells wasn't sure, but he'd seen trained people do that. People who didn't like to be surprised. At 14:15, the sheriff checked in again. Still nothing. Wells shook his head. He looked at the feed one more time. She was back on the bench, same position, same posture. The kind of stillness that made your skin itch if you stared at it too long. The silence wasn't defensive. It was practiced. At 14:29, the phone rang. Homeland Security requesting a briefing. They'd picked up the fingerprint query. No hits. But someone had flagged the search pattern. They wanted to know who was asking about a woman with no name and coordinates, linked to offshore shipping lanes. Wells didn't answer. Not right away. He was still watching the camera feed. She was smiling. Just barely. But it wasn't fear. It wasn't relief. It was something else, like she knew this moment was coming. Like it was all part of the plan. At 15:02, Detective Wells entered interview room 1 with 2 cups of coffee. Both black, both hot. The woman sat exactly where the camera last showed her, hands folded, back straight, her eyes tracing his reflection in the one-way mirror rather than looking at him directly. He set 1 cup in front of her without comment, then took a seat across the table and waited. 2 minutes passed before he spoke. He didn't ask her name, didn't run through charges or threats. Instead, he mentioned the weather. Vermont's late autumn cold, the kind that got into your bones. She didn't move, not a nod, not a blink, just watched. He shifted tactics, gave her small pieces of his own background, Army, CID, Fort Campbell, transferred into civilian work a decade ago. Nothing fancy, he said. She blinked slowly. Once. That was it. He tried again, leaning forward. You're making this harder than it has to be. No movement, no response. He added that the sheriff was considering calling in federal agencies, that if she wanted to avoid a long chain of legal headaches, now would be the time. She sipped the coffee, still silent. The room was quiet enough for Wells to hear the faint hum of the air vent. Overhead, he let the silence stretch. Some people cracked under stillness. She didn't flinch. At 15:26, Wells laid out the notebook with the coordinates, asked what the numbers meant. She glanced down, gave it half a second, then looked back up at him. It wasn't indifference. It was assessment. He recognized the look. He'd used it himself in a dozen interviews measuring threat, utility, intent. Rodriguez entered 10 minutes later to hand over a printout. He paused mid-step, eyes catching the underside of her left wrist. A scar, pale against her skin, ran straight across at an angle. His brows pulled together. He stepped back out. Later, he whispered to Wells, it looked like a rappel burn. From a fast rope, too clean for anything accidental. At 15:49, Wells mentioned it, said the scar didn't match her cover story. She met his eyes for the first time and spoke without hesitation. Rock climbing accident. Her voice was calm, clipped, without emphasis. Wells said nothing. He just made a note on his pad and leaned back in his chair. She had broken her silence, but only to lie with conviction. And that, somehow, confirmed more than the truth might have. At 16:00, he ended the session. As he stood to leave, she glanced up again, just briefly. Her posture was still perfect, her breath slow and even. Wells knew the signs. She wasn't scared. She was trained, and she was waiting. For what? He couldn't tell. But she wasn't improvising. She was following protocol, her own. At 08:33, the courtroom in Windsor County opened to the public, though no one expected much. Just a routine arraignment for a woman booked on weapons violations and refusal to identify. A few reporters from local outlets showed up, curious about the sealed case name on the docket. Most in the room figured she was some eccentric prepper or survivalist caught with the wrong gear. She entered quietly, flanked by 2 deputies. Orange jumpsuit, no shackles on her feet, but her hands were cuffed. Her face was blank, not defiant, just unreadable. She took her seat next to a disheveled public defender flipping through a folder with visible frustration. No cooperation, no backstory, just pages of blanks and a name she wouldn't confirm. Judge Diane Colburn looked tired, a former JAG officer. She didn't waste time. She barely glanced at the attorneys before asking for a plea. The defender started to request a continuance when a voice called out from the gallery, Homeland Security, Your Honor, we're requesting transfer of custody due to ongoing investigation. Before the judge could respond, another voice cut in. FBI jurisdiction, Your Honor. We believe the suspect may be tied to cross-state intelligence breaches. The 2 agents glared at each other across the aisle. The judge rubbed her temples, then rapped the gavel once. This is still a state courtroom. We'll address jurisdiction after arraignment. The clerk began reading the charges: possession of an unregistered firearm, refusal to identify, suspicion of coordinated activity. The woman remained motionless, eyes fixed ahead. The crowd leaned forward. Something didn't fit. This wasn't how threats acted. This wasn't fear or arrogance, it was something else. At 8:41, the heavy double doors at the rear of the courtroom opened. Not slammed, not rushed, just a quiet, deliberate push. A man entered in full navy dress whites, ribbons and medals gleaming beneath the overhead fluorescence. 2 officers followed behind him, silent and still. Every veteran in the room, and there were several, instinctively stood. So did both agents. Even the judge sat straighter. The Admiral didn't speak. He walked calmly down the center aisle, handed a sealed manila envelope to the bailiff, and waited. The judge opened the document. Her expression shifted in phases. First confusion, then realization, then something closer to reverence. She looked up. In light of documentation from the Department of Defense, all charges are dismissed, effective immediately. This matter is now classified as a national security concern. Court is adjourned. Murmurs rippled through the room. Reporters scrambled. Deputies looked to each other for guidance. The Admiral stepped forward and faced the defendant. The bailiff removed her cuffs. She stood slowly, now with unmistakable posture. Chin up, shoulders squared. He nodded. Commander Hayes, the Navy apologizes for the inconvenience. The room fell absolutely silent. Even the ticking wall clock seemed to pause. Wells, seated near the front, blinked twice. He understood then. She hadn't been hiding guilt. She'd been hiding rank. The moment her name was spoken aloud, everything changed. Commander Hayes. It hung in the air with the weight of something final, like a key unlocking a door no one knew was there. The Admiral's voice wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. The title alone was enough to redraw the entire shape of the courtroom. The deputies who had cuffed her stepped back instinctively. Their posture shifted, not from fear, but from sudden, humbling recognition. They'd handled her like a suspect. Now they stood near a combat-decorated officer, a woman who outranked almost everyone in the building, and had kept it hidden without a single word of protest. Hayes turned to face the judge, her eyes steady. Judge Colburn, who'd been prepared to push through a routine case, now looked genuinely shaken. Her legal training held, but her voice softened. Commander, if there's anything this court can do— Hayes gave a slight shake of her head. That won't be necessary, ma'am. Her tone was low but unmistakably firm. Not angry, just resolved. Wells rose from his seat. He watched her now without suspicion, without defense, just with the quiet realization that he'd been speaking to someone playing a part far deeper than he understood. Her stillness, her silence. It hadn't been fear or resistance. It had been training, patience, mission clarity. The courtroom itself seemed to breathe differently. Veterans in the gallery straightened their backs. A retired Marine in the second row removed his cap. The two federal agents slowly stepped aside. No more arguments about jurisdiction. They recognized something bigger than paperwork had just walked through the door. The Admiral extended a hand toward Hayes, but she didn't move yet. She turned instead to the deputies. Thank you for your professionalism. You did your job. Then to the public defender, still holding a stack of useless legal forms. Sorry for the lack of cooperation. He nodded once, awkwardly, no apology necessary. Frank, who had arrived minutes earlier and stood near the door, took it all in silently. He hadn't planned to stay, just wanted to see the end of the story he'd been drawn into. Now he understood it wasn't the end at all, just a reveal, a shift in the lens. Hayes stepped down from the defendant's platform and joined the Admiral. He nodded to her, but it was the kind that passed between equals. As they turned to exit, the entire gallery stood, not from instruction, not out of obligation, but because it felt right. Outside the courthouse, a black Suburban waited with tinted windows and no markings. The air smelled of sea wind. Across the harbor, a gray silhouette of a naval ship cut across the morning haze. Hayes paused at the top of the steps. Her uniform wasn't visible yet, but everything about her now read as military. Her posture, her silence, the way she scanned the horizon not as a civilian, but as someone trained to find what others missed. The sheriff approached the Admiral. Admiral, with all due respect, we need to understand what just happened. The Admiral didn't flinch. Commander Hayes has been operating under classified directive as part of a national security assignment. Her identity was suppressed for mission continuity. She poses no threat to your jurisdiction? The sheriff glanced at Hayes, guilt in his eyes. I owe you an apology. She shook her head. You were doing your job. You couldn't have known. Wells stepped beside them. I saw the way she moved, the way she calculated. I thought she was dangerous. The Admiral turned to him. She is, but not to you. That's why she does what she does, so the rest of us don't have to be. A man in a VFW hat stepped forward from the crowd. Excuse me, ma'am. I was a corpsman with 1st Marines. Desert Storm. I knew that stance looked familiar. He held out a hand. Thank you for whatever it is you do. She took his hand without hesitation. Thank you for yours. Photographers stood at the edge of the parking lot, lenses raised but kept at bay by 2 Navy officers. One reporter shouted a question. Commander, will you make a public statement? Hayes turned her head, then spoke clearly. No comment. And I would appreciate privacy. With that, she stepped into the waiting Suburban. The door shut behind her with a quiet finality. The crowd watched as the vehicle pulled away, escorted by 2 unmarked SUVs. Silence returned to the steps. Frank watched the convoy disappear down the hill. He'd never seen a salute given by law enforcement before. But as the vehicles passed, several deputies raised their hands in crisp, clean gestures. It wasn't protocol. It was respect. Wells remained on the steps long after the rest had cleared. He wasn't trying to figure out who she was anymore. That part was answered. Now, he was wondering what kind of world required people like her to exist in. Silence. What kind of mission demanded a person become invisible to succeed? And how many more like her were out there, walking among them, unnoticed? Back inside, the courtroom emptied out slowly. Judge Colburn remained behind her bench, fingers resting lightly on the sealed file. She didn't look at it again. She didn't need to. She simply said to the clerk, "Strike the case from the docket, permanently." Then added, quietly, "Some debts are paid in silence." At 06:09, Frank unlocked the front gate of Riverbend Range, the same way he had for nearly 12 years. The frost hadn't melted off the grass yet, and his breath fogged in the air as he crossed the gravel toward the office. He didn't expect anyone for at least another hour, especially not her. The silver sedan rolled in slow, tires crunching over rock and ice. She stepped out wearing the same jacket, same ball cap, only this time without the need to hide. There was something lighter in the way she moved. Still efficient, still measured, but no longer cloaked. "Morning, Commander," Frank said, nodding toward the lane benches. She gave a soft smile. "Just Hayes is fine today." She opened the trunk and pulled out her rifle case. Frank recognized it instantly. "We had your gear delivered back last week," he said. "Sheriff sent it over through a courier." She nodded once. "I figured. Just came to make sure everything's intact." Inside the office, he handed her a secured container. She opened it on the table, checking each item carefully. The rifle, magazines, cleaning kit, even her notebook, everything in place. She took a quiet breath, then glanced at the range. "One last shot," Frank asked. She tilted her head. "Why not?" They walked out to lane 11, same as before. She moved with that signature rhythm, not rushed, not showy, just clean. When she settled into position, she didn't bother with a scope. The steel plate at 350 yards swung lightly in the breeze. Frank raised the binoculars. She fired once. The sound was soft, dampened by the still air. The plate rang. Center hit. "Same as last time," he said. "Better light today." She broke down the rifle without a word. He watched her hands, fast but thoughtful. Years of training still evident in each movement. When she closed the case, she looked up and said, "Thanks for not stepping in." Back when the deputies came, Frank shrugged. "Wasn't my place. But I did make a call." "To who, old Navy buddy?" "Pentagon desk now." He made sure the right eyes saw the arrest log. She paused for a beat, then gave a small nod. "I thought someone had cleared the way." Frank leaned on the bench, arms folded. "I knew there was something about you." Didn't expect the full courtroom twist, though. She smiled faintly. That wasn't part of the original plan. He looked out toward the trees. "I served on subs, nothing glamorous. Sonar chief. Spent more time underwater than I care to count." She listened without interrupting. "Operation Silent Harbor," she said after a while. "You heard of it. News mentioned a port threat. East Coast. Didn't get much press." Frank nodded slowly. "I figured someone stopped something big. We did." She didn't elaborate, but the way she said it left no doubt. She picked up her case. "You'll probably see more of us out here. Eventually. Not all of us can stay buried forever." Frank watched her walk to the car, then called out, "You ever come back through? You've got a lane reserved." She paused. Hand on the door. "Some of us are always around. Frank, you just don't see us." As the engine faded into the morning mist, Frank stood for a long while at the edge of the gravel, remembering the faces of people he'd once served with. And now, one more. The kind who carry the weight of silence, so the rest don't have to. At 09:05, Detective Marcus Wells stepped through the last security checkpoint at Naval, Station Norfolk, escorted by a young officer who addressed him as Sir, even though his badge carried no rank here. The air was brisk, the kind of clear morning that hinted at the coming winter. Inside a small auditorium, already half filled with officers in dress uniform and civilian personnel who all carried themselves like they'd seen things most never would. Wells found a seat near the back. No cameras, no press. Just rows of chairs, a simple podium, and a projection of the Navy SEAL on the wall. The room quieted naturally as Admiral Jonathan Wilson stepped forward. The only sound his shoes on the tile floor. When he spoke, his voice filled the space not with volume, but with presence. "Ladies and gentlemen, today we honor a member of our naval special warfare community whose service, by its nature, often goes unseen. Commander Alexandra Hayes has completed 12 years of active duty. including 5 years of direct action with DevGru and multiple operations in denied environments. Wells sat straighter. He hadn't heard that acronym spoken aloud before. Development Group, the elite within the elite. SEAL Team 6. He glanced at the people around him. No one looked surprised. Admiral Wilson continued. Commander Hayes graduated first in her class at Coronado. She was among the first women to qualify for operational integration within Naval Special Warfare Development Group. During Operation Silent Harbor, she spent 11 months embedded in a civilian profile, tracking and neutralizing emerging domestic threats with international funding. Her decisions prevented coordinated attacks on 3 eastern seaboard ports. Her detainment during the final phase of the mission was a calculated risk she accepted to protect operational integrity. She remained silent under scrutiny, upholding mission parameters until intervention was authorized. Wells felt a flush of embarrassment rise to his ears. He remembered her face through the glass, the cuffs, the notebook, the stillness. He'd thought she was hiding something. And she was, just not what he imagined. The Admiral read from the commendation. 16 confirmed threats neutralized. 3 intelligence leads passed to DHS and FBI. 0 operational compromise. Commander Hayes stood, her Navy uniform a stark contrast to the jeans and jacket he remembered. The ribbon rack on her chest told its own story. Silver and gold against navy blue. He didn't know half of them, but he didn't need to. She stepped forward, received the award with calm precision, and offered a single nod of acknowledgement. No speech, no flourish. Just the quiet presence of someone who had given years in silence and asked for nothing in return. After the ceremony, Wells waited near the exit. When Hayes approached, he offered a hesitant hand. Congratulations, Commander. She shook it firmly. Thank you for coming. Detective, I want to apologize again, he said. Her expression didn't change. You did your job, she replied. That's all any of us can do. As she turned to leave, Wells stood still, the weight of everything she carried finally settling on him. She had let herself be arrested, let herself be doubted, and through it all, she had protected more than anyone in that courtroom would ever know. It had been nearly 6 months since Wells last saw her. Life in Coastal Harbor had settled back into its usual rhythm. He'd returned to cold cases and petty thefts, the occasional drug sweep or traffic fatality. But every so often, when things got too quiet, he'd think about that week. About the woman who'd sat silent in cell 2 and walked out of court flanked by the highest authority he'd ever seen in person. At 1948 on a Thursday evening, as he was finishing reports in the dim light of his office, a knock came at the door, not rushed, just firm, measured. He looked up. Hayes stood there, in civilian clothes, just like the first time, except now he saw her differently. She didn't need to wear a uniform to carry command. She brought it with her in the way she stood still. Detective, she said. It's agent now, he corrected. Standing, NCIS liaison for New England. She gave a single nod. Good. That'll make this easier. She didn't sit right away. She looked around the office, then back at him. We have an upcoming operation. High risk, complex legal environment. It overlaps civilian and federal jurisdictions. And we need someone who understands both. Wells crossed his arms. You're asking me to step into your world, she smiled. You're already in it. You just haven't had the right badge yet. They sat. She pulled a slim folder from her coat, placed it on the desk, and slid it over. He opened it to find satellite imagery, personnel assessments, threat matrices. Nothing stamped, nothing labeled, just clean documentation with untraceable headers. Targets, he asked. Potential threats. Patterned communication activity from a group using rural infrastructure to mask logistics, the kind of thing that floats beneath traditional jurisdiction. He flipped a page. How close are they to acting within 72 hours, she said. Maybe less. We're deploying small unit surveillance. But if it tips into an actionable event, we'll need civilian coordination. No uniforms, no visible command. Wells ran a hand over his jaw. You could have picked anyone. She leaned forward slightly. I picked someone who understands that being right doesn't always mean looking right. You handled a silent operative with restraint and respect. You didn't cut corners. You treated an unknown like a person, not a profile. He met her eyes. There was no flattery in them, just assessment. Then he asked the question he'd been turning over since the courtroom. Why not break cover sooner? She didn't hesitate. The mission wasn't complete. If I had compromised the persona, the whole chain would have unraveled. There were too many nodes still active. That arrest kept the facade intact. We lost a day, but preserved the whole network. Wells closed the folder, What would my role be? Command integrated civilian contact. You'd coordinate with local enforcement, build contingency narratives, manage FaceTime when operators need to vanish fast. You'd also screen new recruits who need placement protocols. So, a bridge. Exactly. He leaned back, stared at the ceiling for a second. You said earlier you needed someone who understands both sides. I've worked both ends of good and bad decisions. I've seen things that felt right fall apart. That qualify me. She stood. It makes you the only person I trust to handle this next step. The others follow orders. You ask the right questions. He looked at the folder again, then back at her. You sure your team's ready for a former small-town detective? Hayes gave the smallest shrug. Sometimes small towns raise people who pay more attention than federal. Training ever teaches? Wells reached for his coat. Where do we start? She smiled again. Tomorrow, 0600, same range. You'll recognize the layout. Different crew. As she left the office, Wells stood for a long moment, staring at the closed door, then down at the folder. The seal embossed faintly on the final page said nothing to most eyes. But he saw it now, understood it. This wasn't a promotion. It was a calling. And this time, there'd be no confusion about who the stranger really was. At 04:58, Frank pulled into the lot, headlights sweeping across gravel and pine. He always opened early during hunting season, but today wasn't business as usual. He'd received a call the night before, minimal details, just a request to be on site and alone by dawn. He wasn't surprised when the first unmarked SUV arrived before the sun broke. The Ridge. By 05:10, two more vehicles followed, along with a box truck painted to look like a local telecom service van. Hayes stepped out from the second SUV, civilian clothes again, but with that unmistakable posture that said the mission had already started. Frank nodded to her. Thought you might be back. We'll need the full range for 72 hours, she said. Exclusive use? That gonna be a problem? Frank didn't even pause. Already cleared the bookings. Canceled the public hours. Told folks we're doing environmental maintenance. Good cover, she replied, then handed him a sealed envelope. Inside was a check large enough to fund the range for half a year. Frank whistled low but said nothing more. He waved toward the main building. You know the layout. What's the story this time? Domestic group. Operating nearby? We've been tracking their logistics, moving materials through a distribution loop that mimics rural shipping routes. They're blending in with utility crews and warehouse staff. Frank frowned. That close within 50 miles, she didn't elaborate. At 05:22, the tech crew started converting the office into a comms hub. Flat screens and encrypted routers replaced the coffee pot and range logbooks. Tactical operators, both men and women, unloaded gear and practiced silence. Most wore plain clothes. A few wore soft shell jackets with no insignia. They moved like they'd done this before. No wasted steps, no chatter. Lane 11 was closed off for storage. Lanes 1 through 5 became briefing areas. A single folding table set up behind the firing line now held 3 laptops and a stack of printed surveillance photos. Frank watched from the door of the shed, sipping from his thermos. He wasn't in the way, and they didn't treat him like an outsider. Not anymore. At 05:45, Hayes gathered the team. Wells stood beside her in civilian tactical gear. He'd grown into the role fast, blending his law enforcement background with their rhythm. Hayes pulled up a topographical map. 3 locations identified as possible staging grounds and abandoned hardware distributor, a hunting lodge with no listed owner, and a large barn outside of Glensfield that showed odd utility spikes. We won't breach unless confirmed, she said. These are civilian zones. No margin for collateral. She pointed to each location, assigning pairs to observe from mobile positions. Drones were prepped for thermal scans, but only under cloud cover. No visual ID from overhead. She looked to Wells. You're our gatekeeper. Local contact if law enforcement asks questions. Your word stops escalation. Wells nodded, already checking message logs from State Patrol. Frank leaned against the outer wall, watching the range transform into something it was never built for. But it worked. Quiet. Out of the way. Familiar terrain. Hayes caught his glance and gave the smallest nod. He didn't need thanks. He just appreciated being trusted. And he understood now this wasn't just about a shooting range anymore. It was part of a system, one designed for the kind of threats most people never saw coming. At 03:27, the thermal drone relayed its final confirmation. 8 heat signatures inside the Glensfield barn, grouped in tight formations near what appeared to be metal crates. No livestock, no farm equipment, one vehicle with its engine cold. Power usage aligned with the intelligence Hayes had flagged. It was the staging ground. Hayes called it in from the mobile unit stationed off a tree line 2 clicks east. Wells received the encrypted message at the range, already dressed in Sheriff Department overgear. By 03:35, he was en route to the county substation with a flash drive of pre-cleared warrants and a fabricated tip tied to a separate narcotics probe. At 04:10, sheriff's deputies, all previously briefed through controlled channels, rolled out in 2 SUVs with a marked cruiser at the rear. They were told what they needed to know: weapons trafficking, possible explosives. No mention of Hayes. No mention of the team in the trees. Overwatch was already in place. 2 spotters with thermal scopes tracked movement from a ridgeline. A third monitored RF traffic. Hayes moved between units without comms chatter, checking placement and sight lines. Her presence was steadying. Everyone kept time with her cadence. At 04:43, Wells pulled up to the perimeter. Local law was already staging. He approached the lead deputy, ran through the plan. Approach from the west side. Block both exits. Announce presence only after entry breach. They would find the weapons. They would find the names. They would take credit. The signal came at 04:52. Law enforcement stacked up at the rear sliding door. No lights, no sirens, just boots and breath. Then the breach quick, controlled, minimal resistance. Inside, suspects froze. One tried to run, slipped on the loose concrete. No shots fired. Hayes heard the scuffle through her earpiece, but didn't move. She watched the thermal readouts flatten. No injuries, no noise, just arrests. By 05:02 it was done. Deputies radioed in successful clearance. 12 crates, 3 long rifles with modified lower receivers, high-capacity magazines, digital comm gear, and cash. No resistance from suspects, everyone compliant. No questions about outside involvement. The local officers loaded evidence and suspects into separate vehicles. The official report would cite anonymous intel routed through a state-level drug task force, enough to check the boxes, not enough to raise flags. Hayes stood up from her overwatch point and tapped twice on her shoulder. Radio. Extraction call. The team began exfil within minutes. No trace. No conflict. They'd spent 4 days staging for a raid that took 11 minutes. Wells returned to the range by 05:40. He found Frank already outside, replacing target frames in lane 6 like it was just another morning. "It's done," Wells said simply. Frank nodded. Didn't ask for details. Don't need to know. Only care that it worked. Hayes arrived an hour later, gear packed tight in a gray duffel. She walked the lane once before coming back to the truck. "Thanks, Frank," she said, "for the space." He shook her hand, firm and quiet. "Just keep the country steady. No medals, no headlines. Just 8 more threats gone before breakfast. And a team already fading back into shadow." The morning air had just begun to shift towards spring when Frank first noticed her. She walked in at 06:23 early enough to suggest routine, but not so early it felt calculated. Tall, lean, maybe early 20s. Wore a university sweatshirt and kept her head down. She signed the waiver, paid in cash, then chose lane 9 without hesitation. Her rifle was clean. Bolt action, matte black, no stickers, no case logos. She moved with care, not flash. But as soon as she chambered the first round, Frank felt it the same stillness Hayes used to carry. No wasted effort. No pre-shot chatter, just breath, settle, fire. At 07:03, he stepped out with binoculars and watched through the glass. 4 rounds into the bull at 300 yards, crosswind creeping left. She compensated without any tool or flag. Just feel. That was the tell. He didn't say anything that day. Just watched as she cleaned up, packed neatly, and left without a word. Her form was perfect. Too perfect. Most civilian shooters had quirks. She didn't. The second time she came. A week later, she brought a man in his 50s. Retired, maybe heavy-set, observant, didn't shoot. He sat behind her and watched without speaking. They communicated with the kind of silence that comes from structured hierarchy. When they left, Frank noted the plate and went back inside. At 14:42 that afternoon, he pulled out the card Hayes had given him. The number was still good. He called, gave the code phrase "blue water," still horizon. The voice on the other end answered instantly. "Go ahead." He described her, the technique, the movement patterns, mentioned the older man, added that she'd passed the crosswind test. They asked for timing, location, any verbal cues. Frank gave the details. At the end, he paused. Just one question. "Hayes, is she still active?" A longer silence followed. "That name isn't in our operational database at present." He understood. Of course, just curious. 3 days later, the pair returned. This time, the young woman shot from prone. The older man walked the range, casually chatting with other shooters. Then, near closing, he approached Frank. "Mr. Sullivan," he said, though Frank hadn't introduced himself. I understand you made a call recently. Frank nodded. She caught my eye. Good instincts. The man glanced over his shoulder. She's in assessment. Early stages. This was part of her test. Maintain cover. Avoid detection. Frank raised an eyebrow. She didn't pass. The man smiled faintly. No, but that's why we're here. They spoke for a few minutes more. The man was direct but courteous. He asked if Frank had ever considered working more formally with them, not as a contractor, not as a recruit, but as a civilian interface. Someone who recognized traits in the field, a fixed point in an ever-moving map. Frank thought about it. The idea felt less foreign than it should have. This place had already become a waypoint. Maybe it was time to admit it. He agreed. 2 weeks later, he received a package, a hardened case with new spotting optics, a digital recorder, and a tablet linked to a secure network. Inside the lid, a single phrase was taped in careful block letters, "Keep watching." Now, on most mornings, Frank stands outside the office with a fresh thermos and a quiet patience. Shooters come and go. Most are just hunters, weekend plinkers, competitive hobbyists. But sometimes one moves too cleanly, loads too smoothly, watches the tree line like they're still in country. When that happens, Frank doesn't ask questions. He watches, observes, notes, and if needed, he makes the call. Sometimes someone shows up a few days later. Sometimes they don't. Either way, the range keeps running. Targets get replaced, brass gets swept. At 06:56 one Friday, the young woman returns, alone this time. She signs in, nods to Frank, and heads to lane 10. Her form's tighter, her transitions quicker. She shoots 3 rounds, each one tight, then pauses. Scans, waits, learning, adapting. Frank sips his coffee, watching her through the window. The sun's just rising over the ridge. The sky is soft gray with streaks of pink. It reminds him of days on the subdeck just before they dove. That hush before systems lit and routines took over. As she packs up, she catches his eye. Nothing spoken, just a nod. Respect. Maybe recognition. He nods back. She drives off. Frank writes one line in the notebook on his desk. Observed improved wind control. Maintained discretion. Likely candidate. Then he flips the page, opens the laptop, enters the log, quietly, like always. Because some people serve in shadows, and some, like him, just keep the light steady enough for them to find their way.